Racist cop arrests black woman, not knowing she's a congresswoman. The autumn breeze carried a hint of winter as Officer Tom Harlan drummed his fingers against the steering wheel of his patrol car. Main Street was quiet, as it usually was on Tuesday afternoons in the small town of Millbrook. The faded storefronts and weather-worn awnings of local businesses cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalks, a testament to the town's struggle to maintain its former glory. Harlan's gaze drifted between the familiar scenes until something caught his attention, a midnight blue Mercedes S-Class that seemed completely out of place among the usual parade of pickup trucks and modest sedans. If you love your family, subscribe now and join us for more heartwarming moments. The car was parked outside Marie's Cafe, where locals gathered for coffee and gossip, but Harlan had never seen this vehicle before. Through the tinted windows, he could make out the silhouette of someone sitting in the driver's seat. The car's pristine condition and obvious luxury struck him as suspicious in this working-class neighborhood. Years of patrol work had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, those instincts were telling him something wasn't right. Harlan pulled his cruiser to the curb, positioning it at an angle that would prevent the Mercedes from making a quick getaway. He adjusted his utility belt as he stepped out, a habit formed over 15 years of service. The weight of his badge felt heavier today, perhaps because of the argument he'd had with his sergeant that morning about his overly aggressive approach to routine stops. As he approached the vehicle, his boots scraping against the rough asphalt, Harlan noticed the driver was a black woman, probably in her mid-40s, wearing what looked like expensive casual clothing. She appeared to be reading something on her phone, completely unaware of his presence. The sight only heightened his suspicions. In his experience, people who could afford cars like this didn't spend their afternoons lurking outside small-town diners. Harlan's knuckles rapped sharply against the window, causing the woman to start. She looked up, her expression shifting from surprise to something he couldn't quite read. Was it annoyance? Defiance? The window hummed as it descended, revealing her perfectly composed features and an air of authority that immediately put him on edge. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice was steady, cultured, carrying none of the nervous energy he typically encountered during traffic stops. "License and registration," Harlan demanded, skipping the customary greeting. Something about her composure irritated him, made him feel like she was looking down on him. "May I ask why?" "I'm simply parked here, waiting for my order from the cafe." The woman's tone remained measured, but there was steel beneath the politeness. "Ma'am, when an officer requests identification, you're required to provide it." Harlan's voice took on an edge he usually reserved for suspects who tested his patience. "This is a high-traffic area, and your vehicle has been stationary for an extended period." "Officer," she began, her patience evident but wearing thin, "I've been here for less than 10 minutes. There are several other parked vehicles on the street, yet I notice you haven't approached any of them. I'm curious about what makes my presence particularly suspicious." The challenge in her words was subtle, but unmistakable. Harlan felt heat rise in his neck, the familiar surge of authority-driven adrenaline coursing through his veins. This woman, whoever she was, clearly needed to be reminded of how things worked in his town. "Step out of the vehicle," Harlan commanded, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his belt. The woman's eyes followed his movement, and something flickered across her face, not fear, as he expected, but a deep, weary recognition. "Officer Harlan," she said, reading his nameplate, "I want to be clear that I'm complying under protest. Your request is unnecessary and, frankly, inappropriate." She reached for her purse, movements deliberately slow and measured. "I said, step out of the vehicle," Harlan repeated, his voice rising. The woman's calm defiance was getting under his skin, making him feel off balance in a way he hadn't experienced in years of police work. She placed her hand on the door handle, and Harlan stepped back, watching as she emerged from the car with a grace that seemed almost choreographed. She stood at her full height, and despite being several inches shorter than him, her presence seemed to fill the space between them. "I am Senator Alana Brooks," she stated firmly, reaching into her purse. "I'm here visiting constituents and waiting for a takeout order. Here's my identification, though I maintain that you have no legitimate reason to demand it." Harlan barely glanced at the ID she held out. The claim that she was a senator struck him as absurd, another attempt to intimidate him, to undermine his authority. He dealt with people pulling the "do you know who I am" card before, but this woman's audacity was on another level. "Put your hands behind your back," he ordered, unclipping his handcuffs. The metal caught the afternoon sun, throwing bright reflections across the storefront windows. "Officer, this is completely unnecessary," Alana said, her voice carrying across the now silent street. A small crowd had begun to gather at the cafe's windows, faces pressed against the glass in morbid curiosity. "I've provided my identification and explained my presence here. What exactly am I being charged with?" "Obstruction of justice," Harlan snapped, the words coming out before he'd fully formed the thought. "Failure to comply with a law enforcement officer's legitimate requests." A sad smile crossed Alana's face, one that spoke of too many similar encounters, too many moments like this. "I see," she said quietly, turning to allow him to cuff her. "For the record, Officer Harlan, I want you to know that everything that happens from this point forward will be remembered exactly as it occurred." The handcuffs clicked into place, the sound echoing off the brick buildings like a gunshot. Harlan could feel the eyes of the townspeople on him, could sense phones being raised to record the scene, but he was too far committed to back down now. He began reciting the Miranda rights, his voice mechanical and distant to his own ears. As he guided Senator Brooks to his patrol car, he noticed Marie herself standing in the doorway of her cafe, holding a takeout bag and wearing an expression of horror. The senator's order, the reason she'd been waiting here in the first place, would go unclaimed, a detail that would later return to haunt him in the sleepless nights to come. The drive to the precinct was silent, but it wasn't the usual tense silence of a perpetrator caught in wrongdoing. Instead, it was the heavy silence of history repeating itself, of patterns so deeply ingrained they had become invisible to those perpetuating them. In his rearview mirror, Harlan could see Senator Brooks sitting perfectly straight, her eyes fixed forward, her dignity intact despite the handcuffs binding her wrists. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Officer Harlan led Senator Brooks through the precinct's worn linoleum corridors. The familiar smell of stale coffee and industrial cleaner filled the air, but today it seemed somehow different, almost accusatory. Officers stopped their conversations mid-sentence as the unlikely pair passed, their eyes following the senator's dignified stride despite her restrained hands. Jenny Martinez, the desk sergeant who had worked dispatch for 20 years, dropped her pen when she recognized the senator. The clatter echoed through the suddenly silent booking area, a sharp punctuation to the mounting tension. Harlan felt sweat gathering at his collar, but he pressed forward, maintaining his grip on the senator's arm perhaps a bit tighter than necessary. "Processing a suspect for obstruction," Harlan announced, his voice carrying a false confidence that fooled no one. Jenny's eyes darted between him and the senator, her expression a mix of disbelief and growing horror. "Tom," Jenny started, using his first name in a way she rarely did on duty. "Are you sure about Dash?" "Just process her," Harlan snapped, cutting off what he knew would be an unwanted question. Senator Brooks remained silent, but her presence seemed to fill the room, making the space feel smaller, more confined. Officer Mike Chin, who had been filing paperwork nearby, suddenly found an urgent need to make a phone call, disappearing into the break room with unusual haste. The whispers began almost immediately, spreading through the station like smoke under closed doors. Harlan could feel his carefully constructed world of authority and respect beginning to crack around the edges. "I'll need to make my phone call," Senator Brooks stated, her voice carrying the same calm authority it had displayed on the street. It wasn't a request, and everyone in the room knew it. Harlan hesitated, his jaw working silently as he searched for a reason to deny her. Finding none, he gestured toward the ancient phone mounted on the wall. "Make it quick," he said, trying to maintain some semblance of control over the situation. The senator moved to the phone with remarkable grace despite her restraints. Her fingers, steady and deliberate, punched in a number from memory. The room fell silent again as everyone strained to hear her conversation. "Marcus?" "Yes, it's me. I'm currently being held at the Millbrook police station." Officer Tom Harlan has arrested me for obstruction while I was waiting for takeout at Marie's cafe. She paused, listening. No injuries. Yes, that's correct. Thank you, Marcus. The brevity and precision of her call sent a chill down Harlan's spine. There was something in her tone that suggested she'd just set something massive in motion, like a boulder beginning its descent down a mountainside. He watched as she replaced the receiver with the same composure she'd maintained throughout the entire ordeal. That was my chief of staff, she informed him, though he hadn't asked. He'll be making several calls now, including one to your mayor and another to the Associated Press. I imagine things will get rather busy here shortly. Harlan felt his stomach drop, but he forced his face to remain impassive. He'd made his decision out on the street, and he was determined to see it through, even as doubt began to gnaw at the edges of his consciousness. He gestured for her to return to the booking area, where Jenny sat frozen, her hand hovering over the keyboard. The clicking of computer keys filled the tense silence as Jenny began the booking process, her fingers moving with unusual hesitation. Each question seemed to hang in the air longer than necessary. Name, date of birth, address. Senator Brooks answered each one with precise clarity, her responses carrying in weight that made them sound like testimony rather than routine booking information. Through the glass partitions separating the booking area from the main office, Harlan could see officers gathering in small groups, their heads bent together in urgent conversation. Phones throughout the precinct began ringing with increasing frequency, creating a cacophony that seemed to mirror his mounting anxiety. Officer Chin reappeared, his face noticeably paler than when he'd left. He made a beeline for Captain Lisa Gomez's office, barely acknowledging Harlan as he passed. Through the captain's office window, Harlan watched Chin gesturing animatedly, his usual calm demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. Your surname is spelled Brooks, correct? Jenny asked, her voice barely above a whisper. That's correct, the senator confirmed. The same spelling as it appears on my Senate office door in Washington, D.C. The subtle reminder of her position caused Jenny to wince visibly. She glanced at Harlan, a question in her eyes that he deliberately ignored. Instead, he focused on maintaining his stern expression, though he could feel it becoming more brittle by the moment. The precinct doors burst open, admitting a gust of cold air and Officer Rodriguez, who had been out on patrol. He took in the scene before him, his eyes widening as he recognized the senator. Without a word, he pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly, no doubt adding to the growing digital wildfire that Harlan could feel spreading beyond his control. Emergency contact? Jenny asked, her voice cracking slightly. Before the senator could respond, Captain Gomez's door flew open with enough force to rattle the blinds. Her face, usually carefully composed, showed a mix of fury and panic that Harlan had never seen in his 12 years under her command. Harlan, my office. Now. The captain's voice cut through the ambient noise like a blade. She turned to Senator Brooks, her tone shifting dramatically. Senator, please accept my sincere apologies for this situation. We'll have this sorted out immediately. Harlan felt his legs turn to lead as he walked toward the captain's office. Each step seemed to echo with the weight of consequences he was only beginning to understand. Behind him, he could hear Captain Gomez speaking quietly but urgently to Senator Brooks, phrases like deeply regrettable and full investigation drifting across the room. The familiar path to the captain's office had never seemed longer. Through the windows, he could see patrol cars pulling into the parking lot as off-duty officers arrived, drawn by the rapidly spreading news. A news van had already appeared at the edge of the lot, its satellite dish extending skyward like an accusing finger. The air in the captain's office felt thick with tension as Harlan closed the door behind him. Captain Gomez stood behind her desk, bracing herself against it, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The look she fixed him with made him wish he could disappear into the threadbare carpet beneath his feet. The mayor, she began, her voice trembling with contained rage, just called me in a panic because Senator Brooks, a 3-term United States senator who chairs the Justice Oversight Committee, was arrested by one of my officers while waiting for a sandwich. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Please, Officer Harlan, explain to me exactly what the hell you were thinking. Standing in Captain Gomez's office, Harlan felt the familiar certainty of his actions crumbling beneath the weight of her gaze. The room seemed to shrink around him, the walls of certificates and commendations that had once filled him with pride now looking down in judgment. "She was suspicious," he began, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "An expensive vehicle in that neighborhood dash. Suspicious?" Captain Gomez's voice cut through his explanation like a scalpel. What exactly was suspicious about a public servant visiting her constituents? Was it the Mercedes, Officer Harlan? Or was it something else entirely? The captain's question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Harlan wasn't ready to confront. Outside her office, the precinct had erupted into controlled chaos. Through the blinds, he could see officers scrambling to handle the influx of calls, while others huddled around computer screens, no doubt watching the story unfold on social media. "I followed protocol," Harlan insisted, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "She was argumentative, questioning my authority dash." "She questioned your judgment," Captain Gomez corrected, her dark eyes boring into him. "As a United States Senator, she has every right to question why she's being harassed while waiting for takeout. And now I have to question your judgment too, Officer Harlan." The captain moved from behind her desk, her normally composed demeanor crackling with barely contained fury. She picked up her phone, showing him the screen filled with missed calls and messages. "The mayor is beside himself. The chief of police is on his way in. The ACLU has already been contacted. And do you know what the worst part is? None of this had to happen." Harlan shifted uncomfortably, his uniform suddenly feeling too tight around his neck. "Captain, I couldn't have known she was a senator dash." "That's exactly the point." Gomez slammed her hand on the desk, causing the family photo near the edge to topple. "You shouldn't have to know someone's status to treat them with basic respect and dignity. What if she had been a teacher? A doctor? A mother waiting for dinner? Would that have made your actions any less problematic?" The question struck Harlan like a physical blow. In his 15 years on the force, he'd made hundreds of stops, countless arrests, always believing he was doing his job, protecting his community. But now, under the harsh fluorescent lights of his captain's office, those certainties began to waver. "The dash cam footage is already being reviewed," Gomez continued, her voice lowering to a dangerous calm. "Body cam too. Every word, every action, every assumption you made will be scrutinized. Not just by me, not just by internal affairs, but by the entire country. Senator Brooks chairs the Justice Oversight Committee. Harlan, do you understand what that means?" Before he could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. Officer Chin poked his head in, his face ashen. "Captain, CNN is on line 1. The Associated Press is asking for a statement, and there's already a crowd gathering outside." Gomez closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her composure. "Tell them no comment pending investigation. And get PR down here immediately." She turned back to Harlan, her expression hardening. "We're not done here." The ringing of phones had become a constant backdrop, punctuated by the growing murmur of voices outside. Through the window, Harlan could see the news van's lights casting long shadows across the parking lot, where more media vehicles were beginning to arrive. The story was spreading faster than he could process its implications. Captain Gomez's phone buzzed again, this time with a message that made her inhale sharply. "The chief of staff for the governor just texted me. Apparently, Senator Brooks was here to discuss police reform legislation. The irony would be amusing if it weren't so damaging to this department." A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the office blinds, they could see Senator Brooks, now uncuffed, speaking quietly with Jenny at the front desk. Despite everything that had happened, she maintained an air of dignity that made everyone around her seem to fade into the background. Several officers were trying to look busy while obviously straining to hear her words. "Your actions today didn't just cross a line, Harlan," Gomez continued, her voice heavy with disappointment. "They shattered any pretense that this department has moved beyond its problems with racial profiling. Do you understand that? One decision, your decision, has just undone years of community outreach." The weight of her words settled over Harlan like a lead blanket. He thought about all the community meetings he'd sat through, The diversity training sessions he'd dismissed as political correctness gone too far, the complaints he'd brushed off as people being too sensitive. Now, watching Senator Brooks through the window, he began to see those moments in a different light. "I want you to go out there," Gomez ordered, "and apologize to Senator Brooks." Not a qualified apology. Not an "I'm sorry if you felt offended" apology. A real acknowledgement of what you did wrong and why it was wrong. "Captain, Harlan started, but Gomez cut him off with a sharp jest. "This isn't a suggestion, Officer Harlan. This is your one chance to show that you understand the gravity of your actions. Because what happens next will determine not just your future on this force, but the future of this entire department." The walk from the captain's office to the front desk felt like walking through quicksand. Every eye in the precinct followed Harlan's movement, and the usual background noise of the station had dropped to a tense silence. Senator Brooks turned as he approached, her expression neutral but evaluating. "Senator Brooks," Harlan began, his mouth dry. The words he'd rehearsed in his head seemed inadequate in the face of her composed presence. "I want to apologize for my actions today." "Do you understand why you're apologizing, Officer Harlan?" Her question was quiet, but carried across the hushed room. "Is it because I'm a senator, or because what you did was fundamentally wrong?" The question hit him like a bucket of cold water. In the background, he could hear the clicking of camera shutters. Someone was documenting this moment. His first instinct was to defend himself, to fall back on procedure and protocol, but something in her steady gaze made him pause. "I made assumptions," he admitted, the words feeling like gravel in his throat. "I saw what I expected to see, not what was actually there. And I acted on those assumptions without justification." Senator Brooks studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Outside, the number of news vans had multiplied, their satellite dishes creating a forest of metal and wire in the parking lot. The story was growing beyond anyone's control, becoming something larger than just one officer and one senator in a small-town police station. "Your assumptions, Officer Harlan, are not unique to you," she finally said. "They're part of a system that needs to change. Today, you happen to profile a United States senator, which means this incident will make headlines. But what about all the other times? What about the people who don't have the platform I have?" Her words hung in the air, each one striking with precision. Behind them, Captain Gomez stood in her office doorway, watching the exchange with an intensity that suggested this moment would have repercussions far beyond their immediate conversation. Through the front windows, camera crews were setting up their equipment, preparing to broadcast this story across the nation. The reality of what he'd done, not just today, but throughout his career, began to settle over Harlan like a heavy fog. Each justified stop, each routine check, each moment he'd acted on what he'd called instinct, but was something far more insidious, played through his mind with new clarity. The weight of this revelation threatened to buckle his knees. The precinct's glass doors swung open, letting in a blast of evening air and the muffled sound of gathering protesters. Their chants echoed through the building's halls, providing a rhythmic backdrop to Senator Brooks's measured steps as she made her way toward the exit. The crowd outside had grown exponentially in the past hour, their signs visible through the windows: "Stop police harassment," "Justice for all," and "Racial profiling." Harlan watched from near the booking desk, his badge feeling heavier than it had that morning. The senator paused at the threshold, turning to address Captain Gomez one final time. "I trust you'll be implementing comprehensive changes in your department's training and protocols?" It wasn't really a question, and everyone present knew it. Gomez nodded, her usual confidence tempered by the gravity of the situation. "Yes, Senator. We'll be conducting a thorough review of all our procedures, starting immediately." Senator Brooks's gaze swept across the room, lingering for a moment on Harlan. "Remember this day," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent precinct. "Not because it happened to someone with power, but because it happens every day to those without it. The only difference is they don't make the evening news." The doors opened again, and a wall of camera flashes erupted. The senator stepped out into the chaos with the same dignity she'd maintained throughout her ordeal, her composure a stark contrast to the media frenzy that engulfed her. Reporters shouted questions, their voices overlapping in an incomprehensible chorus. Inside, the precinct remained frozen in a moment of collective reflection. Officers who had spent years working alongside Harlan now kept their distance, their averted gazes speaking volumes. Jenny, still at her desk, methodically shredded the partially completed booking forms, each tier of paper like a quiet accusation. "All officers, my office, now," Captain Gomez announced, her voice cutting through the tension. As his colleagues filed past him, Harlan caught fragments of their whispered conversations. Could lose federal funding. Oversight committee. Complete overhaul. The briefing room, usually a place of casual camaraderie during shift changes, felt more like a courtroom as officers found their seats. The familiar smell of coffee and departmental cleaning supplies now seemed cloying, suffocating. Harlan took a seat in the back, aware of the empty chairs on either side of him. Captain Gomez stood at the front, her normally pristine uniform showing signs of the day's stress. Behind her, the department's mission statement hung on the wall, to protect and serve with integrity and respect. The words seemed to mock them now, their golden letters catching the fluorescent light. "What happened today," she began, her voice steady but heavy with meaning, "is not just about Officer Harlan's actions. It's about our culture, our assumptions, our biases." She paused, making eye contact with each person in the room. "And every one of us bears responsibility for allowing these attitudes to persist." Officer Rodriguez, usually the first to defend his fellow officers, sat silently, his face a mask of concern. Chen stared at his hands, folded tightly on the table before him. The usual post-incident bravado was notably absent, replaced by a palpable sense of shame. "Effective immediately," Gomez continued, "all non-emergency operations are suspended pending a department-wide review. Every stop, every arrest, every interaction from the past 6 months will be examined for patterns of bias. And yes, that means your body cam footage will be reviewed. All of it." A collective shift rippled through the room. Officers who had previously dismissed complaints about profiling now looked distinctly uncomfortable. Harlan felt their discomfort as a reflection of his own mounting anxiety. How many of his routine stops would hold up under scrutiny? The captain's phone buzzed on the podium, its screen illuminating with yet another media request. She ignored it, focusing instead on her officers. "The mayor has already called an emergency council meeting. The chief of police will be here within the hour. But before the politicians and press take over this narrative, I want every one of you to understand something." She stepped out from behind the podium, her authority filling the space between the rows of seated officers. "This isn't about bad apples or isolated incidents. This is about a system that we are all part of, a system that needs to change. And that change starts right here, right now." Outside the briefing room windows, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across faces both familiar and strange to Harlan. The protest crowd had swelled, their chants growing louder as darkness approached. Local residents had joined the initial gatherers, their homemade signs mixing with the more professional placards of organized activists who had somehow made it to their small town in record time. Captain Gomez's words still hung in the air when the door opened and Chief Williams entered, his face bearing the weight of countless phone calls and emergency meetings. The officers started to rise, but he waved them back down with a weary gesture. His usual commanding presence seemed diminished, as if the events of the day had physically compressed him. "I've just finished a conference call with the mayor, the city council, and the Department of Justice," he announced without preamble. "They're sending a team to conduct a formal investigation into our department's practices." He paused, removing his reading glasses to rub his eyes. "This isn't just about today anymore. This is about every complaint we've dismissed, every warning we've ignored, every time we've chosen comfort over accountability." Harlan felt the eyes of his colleagues flicker toward him before quickly looking away. In the back of his mind, faces began to surface. All the stops he'd made over the years, all the times he'd relied on what he'd called instinct, but now recognized as something far more troubling. Each memory carried new weight, new meaning. The chief continued, his voice growing stronger. "Senator Brooks's chief of staff has released a statement. It's already trending nationwide. He pulled out his phone and began to read. Today's incident is not about one officer or one department, but about the systemic biases that persist in law enforcement across our nation. Senator Brooks chose not to use her position to avoid this confrontation because millions of Americans cannot. They face these interactions daily, without cameras, without headlines, without recourse. The words seemed to physically impact the officers in the room. Rodriguez, who had spent 15 years on the force, suddenly looked decades older. Chen's usually steady hands trembled slightly as he took notes. Jenny, who had slipped into the back of the room, pressed her fingers to her lips as if to hold back words she couldn't allow herself to speak. Through the windows, camera lights created artificial day in the parking lot. National news anchors stood before their crews, their voices carrying faintly through the glass. Small-town police department now at the center of a national debate. Questions about systemic racism in law enforcement. Senator Brooks's office calling for comprehensive reform. The chief's phone buzzed again. Another call, another media request, another demand for answers. He silenced it with a gesture that spoke of exhaustion and resignation. "We're implementing immediate changes," he announced. Mandatory sensitivity training, review of all stop procedures, community oversight panels. But let's be clear, these are just first steps. The real work, the hard work, starts with each of you. He turned to Harlan, and the room seemed to hold its breath. "Officer Harlan, you're on administrative leave pending the investigation. I need your badge and gun." The words, though expected, hit Harlan like physical blows. With trembling fingers, he began to unfasten his badge, the metal warm from being pressed against his chest all day. Each movement felt like an admission, each click of metal against metal like a judge's gavel coming down. As he placed his service weapon and badge on the table, the reality of his situation finally broke through his defensive walls. This wasn't just about his career anymore. His actions had turned their small town into a national symbol, their department into a case study in everything wrong with modern policing. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on him until he could barely breathe. The protest chants outside had evolved into a song, the melody carrying through the walls with haunting clarity. "No justice, no peace," they sang, their voices rising and falling like waves against the shore of his consciousness. In that moment, Harlan realized that while his day of reckoning had arrived, it was only the beginning of a much larger awakening. Chief Williams gathered Harlan's badge and gun with careful movements, as if handling evidence at a crime scene. In a way, Harlan thought, that's exactly what they were, evidence of his own failure to see beyond his biases, to serve with the integrity his position demanded. The chief's next words confirmed his thoughts. "The hardest part of change is acknowledging our own role in maintaining the status quo. Today, we can no longer hide behind procedures and protocols. Today, we face ourselves." The morning after Senator Brooks's arrest dawned cold and gray, but the atmosphere outside the Millbrook Police Department was anything but quiet. The crowd that had gathered the previous evening had grown exponentially, their voices rising above the usual morning traffic. Local coffee shops had run out of supplies as protesters and media personnel alike sought refuge from the autumn chill. Harlan sat in his living room, blinds drawn, watching his face appear on every major news network. His official department photo, taken 3 years ago, stared back at him from screens across America. The headlines scrolled past with mechanical regularity. Senator's arrest sparks national debate. Police profiling under scrutiny. Small-town officer becomes symbol of systemic racism. His phone had been ringing nonstop since dawn. Reporters, old colleagues, even his mother from 2 states away, all wanting to understand, to hear his side of the story. He'd stopped answering after the 3rd call, but the messages kept coming. Each notification sound felt like another nail in the coffin of his career. On his coffee table, that morning's local newspaper lay unopened, but he could see his name in the headline through the thin paper. The Millbrook Gazette, usually concerned with local events and high school sports, had pushed everything else aside for this story. His story. Their story. The television droned on, a panel of experts dissecting his actions with clinical precision. What we're seeing here, a distinguished-looking professor of criminal justice was saying, is a textbook example of implicit bias in policing. Officer Harlan's actions reflect deeper systemic issues that persist throughout law enforcement. Another panelist, a former police chief from a major city, nodded in agreement. The fact that this happened to a United States senator only highlights what communities of color have been saying for years. If someone of Senator Brooks's stature can be profiled and arrested while simply waiting for takeout, imagine what happens to ordinary citizens every day. The sound of car doors slamming outside his house made Harlan jump. Through a gap in the blinds, he could see news vans parking along his usually quiet street. Neighbors peered from behind their curtains, watching as reporters set up their equipment on his lawn. The sanctuary of his home was becoming another fishbowl. His cell phone buzzed again, a text from Jenny at the station. National civil rights leaders are holding a press conference at 2 p.m. They're calling for a complete overhaul of the department. Chief Williams is considering early retirement. This is bigger than any of us imagined. Harlan's hands trembled as he set the phone down. On screen, they were showing footage from body cameras of his previous stops, analyzing his tone, his body language, his choice of words. Years of what he'd considered routine police work were being laid bare, examined through a lens he'd never allowed himself to consider. The doorbell rang, making him flinch. Through the door's peephole, he could see a cluster of microphones and cameras waiting expectantly. The questions came muffled but insistent. Officer Harlan, do you have a statement? Were you following department protocol? Do you understand the implications of your actions? His laptop chimed with an email notification. Opening it, he found a message from Captain Gomez. Internal Affairs wants to meet with you tomorrow at 9 a.m. The department's civil rights attorney will be present. This isn't just about your badge anymore, Tom. The Justice Department is involved now. The reality of his situation pressed in from all sides. What had started as a routine stop, at least in his mind, had become a catalyst for a national conversation. His name was becoming synonymous with everything wrong in modern policing, his actions a case study in bias and abuse of power. On social media, hashtags bearing his name trended nationwide. Videos of his interaction with Senator Brooks, captured by bystanders and security cameras, had gone viral. Each new share, each retweet, each comment added another layer to the growing narrative of systemic injustice that he had come to personify. The television caught his attention again as Senator Brooks appeared on screen, addressing a crowded press conference in Washington. Her composure remained intact, her voice steady as she spoke about turning this incident into an opportunity for change. What happened in Millbrook isn't unique, she was saying. It's just finally visible to those who have had the privilege of looking away. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows through Harlan's blinds as his television continued its relentless coverage. Social media analysts were now dissecting his department's history, pulling up statistics and old complaints that had been buried in filing cabinets and forgotten databases. Each revelation felt like another blow to his already crumbling worldview. Breaking news flashed across the screen as Mayor Richardson appeared at an emergency press conference outside City Hall. The usually confident politician looked haggard, his tie slightly askew as he faced the forest of microphones. We are announcing the formation of an independent review board to examine all departmental practices and procedures. Additionally, we've accepted Chief Williams's immediate resignation, effective as of this morning. Harlan's coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. Chief Williams, the man who had hired him 15 years ago, who had championed his promotions, who had been a mentor and friend, was gone. The pieces of ceramic scattered across the floor seemed to mirror the fragments of his professional life. His phone buzzed with another text, this time from Officer Rodriguez. They're interviewing everyone who's worked with you. Chun broke down crying when they showed him the statistical analysis of his traffic stops. We're all seeing things we didn't want to see before. Outside, the crowd of reporters had grown. Their satellite trucks lined his street like sentries, broadcasting his disgrace to the world. Neighbors he'd known for years hurried past with averted eyes, some stopping to give interviews about what kind of officer, what kind of person, they'd thought he was. The television switched to a live feed from the Senate floor, where Senator Brooks stood at the podium, her voice carrying the weight of personal experience. Today, I'm introducing the Law Enforcement Accountability and Professional Standards Act. This legislation isn't just about one incident in a small town. It's about addressing the systemic biases that persist in police departments across our nation. The camera panned across the chamber, showing senators of both parties rising in support. What had happened in their quiet town was becoming a watershed moment, a catalyst for change that would ripple through departments across the country. His laptop chimed again. This time it was an email from the police union representative. The department is facing multiple civil rights investigations. Your case is being cited in lawsuits across 3 states. We'll do what we can, but you need to prepare yourself for what's coming. Social justice organizations had begun organizing nationwide protests, using his name and badge number as rallying cries. In cities across America, thousands gathered to share their own stories of profiling and harassment, each account adding weight to the crushing burden of his actions. The doorbell rang again, but this time it wasn't reporters. Through the peephole, he recognized Pastor Michael from his church, the man who had baptized his daughter just last year. The religious leader stood alone on his porch, his expression one of concern rather than condemnation. Harlan opened the door just enough to hear the pastor's words. "The congregation is divided, Tom. Some want to support you. Others are calling for your removal from the church council. But I'm here because I think you need someone to talk to who remembers the man you were trying to be, not just the mistake that's defining you now." The words hit him harder than any headline or news report. In all the chaos of the past 24 hours, no one had spoken to him as a person rather than a symbol. The pastor's presence forced him to confront not just his actions, but their impact on every aspect of his life: professional, social, spiritual. On his street, more protesters had joined the media encampment. Their signs told stories of other encounters, other moments where power had been misused, where bias had masqueraded as procedure. His name and face had become a touchstone for a much larger conversation about justice, accountability, and the nature of policing itself. A gentle rain began to fall, but the crowds didn't disperse. If anything, the weather seemed to strengthen their resolve. Through the growing darkness, their candles and phone lights created a constellation of witness to his downfall, each point of light representing another voice demanding change. The pastor's words echoed in his mind as he watched the vigil grow. Sometimes it takes a personal crisis to open our eyes to larger truths. The question now isn't just about what you did, Tom. It's about what you're going to do with this understanding. 3 days after the arrest, Harlan sat in the sterile conference room of the department's mandated sensitivity training center. The facilitator, Dr. Sarah Martinez, a civil rights attorney turned police reform advocate, stood before a room of officers, but her words seemed directed specifically at him. "Bias isn't always obvious," she explained, her voice carrying years of experience in confronting uncomfortable truths. "It's in the split-second decisions, the unconscious assumptions, the moments we tell ourselves we're just following protocol." She clicked to the next slide, a series of statistics highlighting racial disparities in traffic stops across the country. Harlan's throat tightened as he recognized patterns that mirrored his own record. 15 years of stops, searches, and arrests spread across the screen in cold, unforgiving numbers. Each data point represented a moment he'd justified to himself, a decision he defended as professional judgment. During the break, he found himself alone in the building's empty bathroom, staring at his reflection in the industrial mirror. The face looking back at him seemed older, the lines around his eyes deeper than they'd been a week ago. His wedding ring caught the fluorescent light as he gripped the sink's edge, remembering his wife's words from the night before. "I always trusted that you were one of the good ones," she'd said, her voice heavy with disappointment. "But now I'm wondering if I was just choosing not to see." She'd taken their daughter to stay with her parents, claiming she needed time to think, to process what this meant for their family. Back in the training room, Dr. Martinez was sharing body camera footage from departments across the country. "Watch the language used," she instructed. "Notice the differences in tone, in patience, in benefit of the doubt given." Each example felt like a mirror being held up to his own conduct, reflecting moments he dismissed or justified throughout his career. Officer Chun, sitting 2 rows ahead, raised his hand. But what about officer safety? We're taught to be cautious, to protect ourselves. His voice carried the uncertainty they were all feeling, the struggle between ingrained practices and emerging awareness. Officer safety is crucial, Dr. Martinez acknowledged, but we need to examine how often that concern becomes an excuse for discriminatory behavior. How many times have we labeled someone as suspicious, based on nothing more than our own biases? The question hung in the air like smoke, making it hard for Harlan to breathe. He remembered the moment he'd first spotted Senator Brooks and her Mercedes, the immediate assumptions that had formed in his mind. What had really made her suspicious? The car? The neighborhood? Or something he'd never allowed himself to acknowledge? During the lunch break, no one sat with him. His former colleagues maintained a careful distance, as if his situation might be contagious. Through the cafeteria windows, he could see protesters still gathered outside, their signs now weather-worn but their determination undiminished. His phone buzzed with a text from Jenny. The FBI just requested all your body cam footage from the past 5 years. They're doing a comprehensive review of stop patterns. The message felt like another nail in a coffin he'd built himself, one traffic stop at a time. The afternoon session focused on community impact statements. Dr. Martinez played videos of citizens sharing their experiences with law enforcement. Each story chipped away at the armor of justifications Harlan had built around his actions over the years. A mother described teaching her teenage son how to survive police encounters. A successful executive recalled being pulled over 3 times in 1 month while driving his luxury car. A college student detailed the trauma of a routine stop that left her afraid to drive at night. As he listened, faces from his own career began to surface in his memory. The young man he'd followed for 3 blocks before finding a reason to stop him. The woman he'd ordered out of her car because her registration was 1 month expired. The teenager he'd handcuffed for attitude during a simple traffic violation. Each memory now carried new weight, new meaning, new shame. The sensitivity training stretched into its 2nd week, each day peeling back another layer of Harlan's professional identity. During a particularly intense session focused on implicit bias, Dr. Martinez introduced an exercise that would haunt him for days to come. Write down every justification you've ever used for a discretionary stop, she instructed the room. Be honest with yourself. No one else will see your list. Harlan's pen hovered over the blank page. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as memories flooded back. Suspicious behavior. Didn't look like they belonged in the neighborhood. Expensive car in a low-income area. Just a feeling. Each phrase now carried the weight of recognition, of patterns he'd refused to acknowledge for years. During one afternoon break, he found himself in the department's records room, pulling his own stop records. The stack of papers felt heavy in his hands, hundreds of interactions, each one a moment where his professional judgment had altered someone's life. The racial demographics were impossible to ignore, the patterns so clear it made his stomach turn. His phone lit up with a text from his daughter. Dad, they're talking about you in social studies class. Mrs. Thompson used your case as an example of systemic racism. I didn't know what to say. The message sat like a stone in his chest. His 13-year-old shouldn't have to bear the weight of his actions, shouldn't have to defend or explain her father's choices. The next day's session focused on personal testimonies. A young Black lawyer shared his story of being stopped 8 times in 1 year, each incident eroding his faith in the system he'd sworn to uphold. As the man spoke, Harlan recognized the careful way he held himself, the deliberate clarity of his speech, adaptations to a world that presumed his guilt. During lunch, he sat alone in his car, reading through comments on a police reform website where his name had become shorthand for privileged authority. One comment struck him particularly hard. Officer Harlan isn't unique. He's just the one who got caught stopping the wrong person. The afternoon brought role reversal exercises. Officers were asked to experience simulated stops from the civilian perspective. Harlan felt his heart race as the training officer approached his vehicle, using the same tone, the same phrases he'd employed countless times. The helplessness, the frustration, the fear, emotions he dismissed in others now coursed through his own body. That evening, he visited Pastor Michael, seeking not absolution but understanding. The church was empty save for the two of them, their voices echoing in the vast space. "I keep thinking about power," Harlan admitted, his words barely above a whisper. "How easily it corrupts, how it blinds us to our own actions. I didn't see myself as prejudiced because I didn't want to see it. It was easier to believe I was just doing my job." The pastor listened without judgment, letting the silence stretch between Harlan's words. Outside, the sun set through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the empty pews where his fellow parishioners once sat beside him without question. "Recognition is the first step," Pastor Michael finally said, "but it can't be the last. The question now is what you'll do with this awareness." Later that night, unable to sleep, Harlan found himself reviewing body camera footage from his past stops. Each interaction revealed patterns he'd been trained to see as professional procedure, but now recognized as something far more insidious. The casual dismissal of civil rights, the assumption of authority, the subtle and not-so-subtle intimidation, all of it played out in high definition, impossible to ignore or explain away. His daughter's text from earlier kept returning to his thoughts. How would he explain this to her? How could he help her understand that sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we've hidden from ourselves? The weight of these questions pressed against his chest, making it difficult to breathe in the quiet darkness of his empty house. The city council chambers had never felt so crowded. Television cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking like artificial stars in the dim room. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The air felt thick with anticipation and the lingering summer heat, despite the struggling air conditioning. Harlan stood at the podium, his prepared statement trembling slightly in his hands. 3 weeks had passed since his encounter with Senator Brooks, 3 weeks of soul-searching, mandatory training, and painful self-reflection. His police uniform, once a source of pride, now hung in his closet like a reminder of everything he needed to change. Senator Brooks sat in the front row, her presence both a challenge and an opportunity. She had agreed to attend this public apology session not for personal vindication, but as she'd stated, to ensure this moment becomes more than just another forgotten promise of reform. Mayor Richardson cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the hushed chamber. "Before Officer Harlan speaks, I want to acknowledge that this meeting is being broadcast live across multiple platforms. What happens here today isn't just about our town. It's about addressing systemic issues that affect communities nationwide." Harlan looked down at his prepared statement, then slowly folded it and placed it in his pocket. The words he'd carefully crafted with the department's PR team suddenly felt inadequate, too polished to convey the raw truth he needed to share. "3 weeks ago," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I made a series of decisions that exposed not just my personal biases, but a deeper problem within our law enforcement system. I stopped Senator Brooks not because of any legitimate concern, but because I saw a Black woman in an expensive car and made assumptions that I'd been making my entire career." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the carefully worded apology they'd expected. In the front row, Senator Brooks leaned forward slightly, her expression intent. "For 15 years, I told myself I was just doing my job. I used phrases like reasonable suspicion and officer discretion to justify actions that were rooted in prejudice. I wasn't the only one, but that doesn't excuse it. Every time I made those choices, I violated not just department policy, but the fundamental rights of the people I was sworn to protect." The cameras whirred softly, recording every word. Through the windows, Harlan could see the crowd gathered outside growing larger, their signs and phones raised to capture this moment. "When I arrested Senator Brooks, I didn't just make a mistake. I demonstrated a pattern of behavior that had become so normal to me, I couldn't even see it anymore. It took this incident, this public revelation, for me to confront the reality of my actions and their impact on countless lives." He turned directly to Senator Brooks, meeting her steady gaze. "Senator, my actions that day were inexcusable. But more than that, they were part of a larger pattern that has caused immeasurable harm to communities of color. My apology isn't just to you, it's to every person I've ever stopped without cause, every citizen whose rights I violated while hiding behind my badge. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Even the usual shuffling and whispers had ceased as everyone watched this unexpected display of raw honesty. Captain Gomez, standing near the side door, had tears in her eyes. "I can't undo the past," Harlan continued, "but I can commit to being part of the solution. I've spent these weeks not just in mandatory training, but in deep reflection about my role in perpetuating systemic racism. I've reviewed every stop, every arrest, every interaction, and the pattern is undeniable." Harlan gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles white with tension. The weight of every eye in the room pressed against him, but for the first time in weeks, he felt the clarity of purpose that had eluded him since that fateful day. "I've submitted my resignation from the police force," he announced, causing another ripple of murmurs through the crowd. "Not because I'm being forced to, but because I believe real change requires more than just policy updates and sensitivity training. It requires those of us who've been part of the problem to step aside and make room for new perspectives." Senator Brooks's expression remained neutral, but her slight nod encouraged him to continue. Behind her, his daughter sat beside his wife, both watching with a mixture of pain and pride that made his voice catch. "But I'm not walking away from this responsibility. I'm committing myself to a new role, working with police departments across the country to address systemic bias. I've accepted a position with the Civil Rights Division's new police reform initiative, where I'll share my story not as an excuse, but as a warning about how easily power and prejudice can blind us to our own actions." The announcement sent journalists scrambling for their phones, fingers flying across keyboards. This wasn't in the press release they'd been given, wasn't part of the carefully orchestrated apology they'd expected to cover. "Senator Brooks," he turned to address her directly again, "your grace in handling this situation taught me more than any training session could. You could have used your position to avoid that confrontation, but you chose to let it play out because you knew it would expose truths that needed to be seen. Your dignity in the face of my prejudice showed me everything that was wrong with my approach to law enforcement." For the first time since the incident, Senator Brooks's composure softened slightly. She rose from her seat, approaching the podium with measured steps that echoed through the silent chamber. "Officer Harlan," she began, her voice carrying the weight of both authority and compassion, "your words today demonstrate something rare in these situations: genuine understanding and commitment to change. But as you've acknowledged, this isn't just about one incident or one officer. It's about transforming a system that has allowed these biases to flourish unchecked." She turned to address the gathered crowd and cameras. "Today, I'm announcing that the Law Enforcement Accountability and Professional Standards Act will include a new provision, the Millbrook Initiative. This program will fund comprehensive bias training and community oversight boards across the nation, using this incident not as a scandal to be forgotten, but as a catalyst for lasting change." Harlan felt tears threatening to fall as she continued. "Mr. Harlan has agreed to serve as one of our primary speakers, sharing his journey from bias to awareness with departments nationwide. His story will help other officers recognize and confront their own prejudices before they lead to similar incidents." The chamber erupted in applause, but Harlan barely heard it. His eyes were fixed on his daughter, who was smiling through her own tears. In that moment, he realized that while his career as a police officer was ending, his real work, the work of making amends and creating change, was just beginning. Outside, the summer sun had begun to set, casting long shadows through the chamber windows. The protesters' signs had transformed from accusations to messages of hope and reform. The media crews were already setting up for their evening broadcasts, preparing to share this unexpected turn of events with a nation that had watched his downfall and would now witness his commitment to redemption. As Senator Brooks extended her hand to him, Harlan understood that this moment wasn't an ending but a beginning. The hard work of systemic change lay ahead, but for the first time since that day outside Marie's cafe, he felt the weight of purpose replacing the burden of shame. His journey from defender of a broken system to advocate for its reform would be long and challenging, but it was a path he now walked with clear eyes and a determined heart. The chamber slowly emptied, But the conversations sparked that day would continue in police departments, community meetings, and homes across the country. The incident that had exposed the worst of law enforcement had somehow created an opportunity for transformation, proving that even the darkest moments could lead to light, if those involved had the courage to face the truth and the commitment to create change. 6 months after the public apology, Harlan stood before a different crowd in a different city. The police academy auditorium was filled with fresh recruits, their uniforms still creased and new, their badges yet untarnished by the weight of daily decisions. Their young faces looked up at him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. They'd all studied his case in their training. "Your badge will give you power," he told them, his voice carrying years of hard-won wisdom. But the real challenge isn't how to use that power, it's how to recognize when it's leading you astray. The presentation screen behind him showed footage from that day outside Marie's cafe, now a standard part of police training nationwide. The Millbrook Initiative had exceeded all expectations. Departments across the country had adopted its guidelines, and early statistics showed promising decreases in discriminatory stops. Senator Brooks's legislation had passed with bipartisan support, creating new standards for police accountability and community oversight. During the Brea K, a young black female recruit approached him. "Sir," she began, her voice hesitant but determined, "I remember when your story broke. I was actually thinking about dropping out of the academy, but watching how you handled everything, it showed me that change is possible, even in the most entrenched systems." Back in Millbrook, things had changed too. Captain Gomez had been promoted to chief, the first Latina to hold the position. Under her leadership, the department had become a model for community-oriented policing. The incident that had once threatened to tear the town apart had instead become a foundation for rebuilding trust. Marie's Cafe had transformed into an unexpected symbol of progress. Regular community dialogue sessions were held there, bringing together officers and citizens to discuss concerns and build understanding. Marie herself had become an advocate for police reform, her perspective as a witness to that pivotal moment lending weight to her words. Harlan's family had found their own path to healing. His daughter, now speaking openly at school about police reform and social justice, had discovered her own voice as an advocate for change. His wife had returned home, their relationship stronger for having confronted difficult truths together. Senator Brooks and Harlan had developed an unexpected partnership, traveling to departments and communities across the country. Their joint presentations were powerful precisely because they came from opposite sides of that fateful encounter. Together, they demonstrated how confronting bias could lead to genuine transformation. The changes weren't always easy. Some officers resisted the new protocols, claiming they hampered effective policing. But the data told a different story. Crime rates remained stable while community trust improved. The Millbrook model, as it came to be known, proved that accountability and effective law enforcement could coexist. 1 year to the day after the incident, Harlan returned to the spot where he'd first seen Senator Brooks's Mercedes. A memorial plaque had been installed, not to commemorate a tragedy, but to mark the beginning of a transformation. The words, chosen by the community, read, "Here, on an ordinary day, our community learned an extraordinary lesson about justice, growth, and the possibility of change." Standing there in the fading light, Harlan reflected on how a moment of profound failure had led to a lifetime mission of reform. The weight of his old badge had been replaced by the responsibility of ensuring its power was never again misused. As the sun set over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the changed landscape of his hometown, he understood that some endings were really just better beginnings in disguise. 5 years after the incident that changed everything, Millbrook hosted a national conference on police reform. The small town had become a pilgrimage site of sorts for law enforcement leaders seeking to transform their departments. The conference center, built with federal funding from the Brooks Act, stood as a testament to how far they'd come. Senator Brooks, now heading the Senate Committee on Law Enforcement Reform, delivered the keynote address to a packed auditorium. Her hair had traces of gray now, but her presence remained as commanding as ever. In the front row, Harlan sat beside his daughter, now a first-year law student focusing on civil rights. 5 years ago, the senator began, routine stop in this town exposed deep-rooted problems in our justice system. Today, that moment has led to measurable change in departments across the nation. The Millbrook Protocol has been adopted by over 500 police departments. Discriminatory stops have decreased by 60% in participating jurisdictions. But numbers only tell part of the story. The data displayed behind her showed what change looked like in concrete terms: increased community trust, improved officer retention, stronger relationships between police and the communities they served. But the real evidence could be seen in the faces of those attending, a diverse mix of officers, community leaders, and activists, all working together toward a common goal. Harlan's own journey had evolved in unexpected ways. The program he'd helped establish had trained over 10,000 officers, using his experience as a starting point for deeper discussions about power, privilege, and responsibility. His daughter often joined him at these sessions, offering a perspective that brought many officers to tears. The voice of a child who had watched her father fall and then rise again, transformed by truth. Marie's cafe had expanded, adding a community center where monthly forums brought citizens and officers together for honest discussions. The walls were lined with photographs documenting Millbrook's transformation, protests giving way to progress, anger turning to action, division becoming dialogue. Marie herself had been appointed to the National Oversight Board created by the Brooks Act, her practical wisdom helping to shape policies that worked in the real world. The town had changed too. The police force now reflected the community it served, with Captain Gomez's leadership setting a new standard for inclusive policing. The training program she'd implemented had become a model for departments nationwide, proving that accountability and effectiveness could strengthen each other. After the conference sessions ended each day, attendees would often walk to the spot where everything began. The memorial plaque had weathered 5 years of sun and rain, but its message remained clear. Visitors would stand there, reading those words about justice and change, understanding that transformation was possible, even in the most entrenched systems. On the final evening of the conference, Harlan found himself back at that spot, this time accompanied by a group of new recruits from departments across the country. As the sun set over Millbrook, casting familiar shadows across changed streets, a young officer asked him if he ever regretted how everything had happened. "I regret my actions that day," he replied, watching the last light fade from the sky, "but I don't regret where they led us." Sometimes it takes our worst moments to show us our best possibilities. Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, their light reflecting off the polished surface of the memorial plaque. The town around them hummed with the energy of change, not the dramatic upheaval of 5 years ago, but the steady pulse of progress, the rhythm of a community that had learned to grow together. In the distance, the conference center lights glowed warmly, guiding the way forward. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth, new chances to prove that what had happened in Millbrook wasn't just a story of one officer's transformation, but a blueprint for changing the very nature of justice in America. The work wasn't finished. It never would be. But the path forward was clear now, lit by the understanding that real change begins with the courage to face uncomfortable truths and the commitment to build something better in their wake.